Well, what is up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Faith and Pop Culture Podcast. It is me, your host, Daniel, and I am joined, as I always am, by the fiery chasm of Mount Doom to my one ring, Mr. Samuel David Kemp. What is up?
Not too much, Daniel. It's always a pleasure to be with you and included in a Lord of the Rings mention. So it
Hey,
must be a
yeah, if you guys
special
know me,
day.
that is high praise. And to keep us on that theme, this is not a regular podcast. We've expanded to a full-on fellowship because we have a trio. We'll let people debate who is Gimli, Aragorn, or Legolas among us. But we're excited today to be joined by a very special guest, and that is Mr. Sean Gaffney. He is a screenwriter, playwright with credits including things like VeggieTales, currently serving as a professor of screenwriting and media at Osbury University, and the author of a very good new book that just released, I think, back in March, What Marvel and the Messiah Can Teach Us About Great Storytelling. Welcome, Sean. Thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you. And watch me get on a horse, and Legolas is immediately eliminated from my category. just saying. Nobody gets on a horse like he does.
Like physics-defying amount that. Hey, well, I don't think we would give you much competition for that, but
Yeah.
we're excited to chat because you have a lot of interesting insights. You've had an interesting, from what it seems like, interesting career path, life journey. Maybe just kind of kick things off. Just kind of learn a little bit about you, because I want to get into this book that you just released, because there's a lot of good stuff in there. But as I was reading through this book, very much struck me as like this is like the culmination of a lot of life experiences, a lot of things that you've done creatively, just personally, sort of where God has kind of led you. So maybe back up a bit. Like how does a young Sean kind of grow to eventually write a book like this and kind of focus in this area?
Yeah. Oh, wow. A couple things along the journey. Too long to tell for this podcast. But I started out in theater as a theater producer. That's my initial training, was theater management and producing. Was in New York City, working theater, general management, producing. I produced off Broadway. I tell people this, it's so far off Broadway that your pay is you're allowed to pay for the posters. So it's, but was working there, ended up heading to Seattle to be the managing director for Taproot Theater up in Seattle, which is a Christian-based theater company, which is also where I picked up my wife. And during that time is when I started writing professionally, writing plays. And I've always been a storyteller. I was the only one surprised when I became a professional writer. Everybody around me was like, well, no, duh. We were wondering when you'd clue in. Yes, became a professional writer. Then, as you said, I sold a VeggieTales script to Phil Vischer and Big Idea. And two things I learned in that. One, Phil completely rewrote me. Which was fantastic for me because he made me funny. And so when people talk about my episode, they'll say, "Oh, I love this line. Yeah, Phil wrote that. Oh, I love this thing. Oh, yeah, Phil wrote that." But it did launch my kind of career beyond theater because I realized you can make money. You can actually make a living in film and television, whereas in theater you can't. And that just kind of branched me out. So I still write plays, but I also started writing film and television. That took me to Hollywood. I studied with Act One, Writing for Hollywood, which is a Christian organization training writers who were interested in being in Hollywood. And from that, while I was in LA, my day job was the story administrator for Warner Brothers Features. So I got to spend almost a decade with them. During some good things and during some not so good things. I was there for the nerds out there, you'll understand this. I was there for the Christopher Nolan Batman movies as we moved into the Zack Snyder universe. So heart romance and heartbreak all in the same journey. Yeah, and then after we're there for a while, and God said go teach. So I left LA and became a professor, and here I am. So still writing and producing movies, some TV shows on occasion, plays, anything with a script, podcasts, narrative podcast. I've done a whole wide variety of things. So that's what got me to this point.
Yeah, well, I think, and I maybe have shared this in the podcast before, but my Warner Brothers story is that we, which well maybe we'll check after recording if we have a mutual contact there, but we knew someone that worked at Warner Brothers, and so they had us come on to visit and kind of tour around the set, and we're eating in like kind of the Warner Brothers, like the cafe,
Yeah.
the area where you, and we're sitting down eating, and Christopher Nolan like comes in and sits at like the table next to us, like for some kind of meeting, and like I think both me and Sam are just major Nolan
Yeah.
fanboys, so like I'm fanboying out, and like I think I probably got up to go to the bathroom like
Right.
3 times in the span of about 20 minutes to kind of walk by the table and see what he's working on, maybe give him some pointers, and so that's my Warner Brothers experience.
It's a fun lot to be on, and I have several commissary stories, but the one that gave me the chills the way yours did is standing behind Clint Eastwood as he was ordering his his turkey meal. It was one of those where after he orders, they say, "What do you want?" And I'm like, "Whatever he had. I don't care. I don't care if I'm allergic. I'm having it." Just the fact that I got to stand that close, but.
Yeah, I feel like
Yeah,
he's one of
you gotta wonder how many people just repeat lines back to Clint Eastwood, when they see him, like, oh no, you make my day,
No,
sir.
you make my day, sir.
I'm kind of curious. This is hearing you share some of that. Something I've always wondered is like, what is that transition from like theater to film? Because like for those of us that
Yeah.
aren't really in that world, you hear theater's the precursor to film, and
Yeah.
all the conversations. But obviously, especially if you know people working in those like, very different world. What was that transition like? Are those quite different universes, or is there a lot of overlap?
There's more and more overlap these days. There used to not be any, which is the same with television and film. There used to be like you're either working in film or you're working in television, not both. And now they're blending a lot more. So you get, your Joss Whedons who'll write a TV show and write a movie and then, direct a play on Broadway kind of thing. Or Aaron Sorkin, who's the king of that, starting in theater. I'm a theater snob in that I do believe that the best screenwriters come from theater, the best actors tend to come from theater, and the best directors tend to come from theater. But that's the theater world is just more immediate. Everything is tested immediately. You work on a film, you write a screenplay for a film. 3 years later, you find out if it worked or not. You write a play, you sit there in the audience, and the audience tells you what's working and what's not working. Theater also gives you the opportunity, if in certain situations, to be rewriting as it's playing. So Tuesday night it plays in front of an audience, and there's no laugh there. So Wednesday night we've rewritten it, and now it's working. So there's a lot of kind of training, but they are different. Film is driven by the image. That is the language. Image builds to action, action to story. So story and film, story is what film does best. Theater, the language is dialogue. So it's not what you're looking at, it's what you're hearing that builds the story. And it actually builds to connection to human relationship. So relationship is what you get when you watch a play. That's its strength. It has story. Just as film has a dynamic. Books, it's words. Words build details, which still builds to theme. So books are about ideas. Films have ideas, but the ideas serve the story. Plays have ideas and plays have plot, but the plot is there to serve the human connection, which is why the audience is there with the actors. We're in the room together because we're creating an experience together. So the fun part about that, and the fun part about never specializing, is you take a story idea and you decide, where's it going to play best? Where's it going to have the most effect? What do I want with this? And there are certain things that just play better live with an interactive audience. I just saw about a year ago Skeleton Church, which is a Salvation Army play. It's a musical, two-person musical, about the development of the Salvation Army through a thing called the Skeleton Army, which were the people opposed to the Salvation Army. They created their own, the atheist version, to combat the ideas. But it was done as a play. The audience was part of it. If you were, the scene where it's the Salvation Army meet, you had a little hymnal in front of you. You were expected to sing along. When you're in the bar, the front row gets mugs that they pour the water into. I mean, it's really interactive. And when you get to the kind of the conversion moment, the moment of realization for the lead character, you're there in the camp meeting with him. And that has a very, very different effect than trying to watch a conversion scene on film where you're distanced by time, space, and you're on the couch or you're in the seats. They're not there with you. You're not an active participant in the same way. So there are things you can do which is why I don't, I'm trying to think if there's any conversion scene in a film that actually works, and I'm having trouble coming up with one. And that's part of it, is it's the wrong medium for what they're trying to do. So there are things you can do. Yeah, there are things like ideas that are just so much better as a book, or so much better as a film, or so much better as a TV series, or so much better as a play.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too because you don't really hear a lot of talk about. I mean, maybe you do if someone that has a foot in sort of that world, but you don't really hear a lot about Christians talking about theater. Like, there's a lot of talking about music, obviously, and like, now faith-based films, that's become a whole thing. There's a big announcement today about streaming and Amazon, kind of the Wonder Project. That's become a whole new frontier. But you don't really hear a whole lot about sort of, the need
There's a reason for that. You guys actually talked a little bit about this in episode 47 when you're talking about fame and the idea of fame. It goes to marketing and fame because it's sexier to have your thing seen by 1 million people than it is to say it was seen by 100 people last night. And I mean, there's reason. Film does some things better, so that's part of it for some people. But for a lot of the church, it's, we could reach so many more people if we do a mass-produced thing versus a relational thing. So that's part of it anyway.
So do you, we maybe get a little off topic here, but so do you think, how would a church then try and get into that industry of theater if there maybe isn't theater, or what recommendations would you have for churches to try and do that? Because it does seem like there has to be almost like a zealotry for the theater in order for it to like get legs and stand up.
Yeah,
you just don't see that enthusiasm for theater. And as someone who has I haven't been to a ton of shows, but there is something really special about live theater performance that you can't duplicate that in a movie or a TV show.
And even the experience of making it. I mean, think about your church's youth group. When the youth group does a play together, it changes the kids.
Yeah.
How they're working together, watching it live, even if it's amateur and not very good because it's, all 7th graders up there singing. It's personal, right? I mean, just like anything else in ministry, you need somebody with a passion for it. I used to, my church back in New York was Redeemer Presbyterian, and I worked it for a year as the person who answers the phone. I was the receptionist in the church office. And we were trained, if somebody were to call, I think every church has this. Somebody's going to call the pastor and say, hey, what we should have is we should have a ministry reading to the blind. Oh, what we should have? We should have a ministry where we take food out to. And our answer was, that's great. Tell us how we can support you in your new ministry, which of course is never what they mean. They mean you should do it.
Right.
But the acknowledgement of that is, well, the person who's passionate about it needs to kind of step forward to it. So if you can find those people in your congregation that have that passion, the same as if you do film, if your church produces movies, find the passion, start small, start with your own stuff, start with, doing things on campus for your audience, and see where it goes. Tyler Perry, that's how he built his empire, was theater. He would do traveling shows on what they call it the Chitlin Circuit, but they would go from church to church doing plays, and over the course of that, he'd be working on a movie, and he'd say, "Hey, let me show you guys a scene from this movie we're working on." And so, kind of had this touring promotion thing. So by the time he had a movie coming out, he already had a huge audience because they had seen the plays. They had already loved what he had to say, and they would go to the movies.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that about him because he's like his whole empire is just right down the road of where we live here in Atlanta. He has all his studios, and I will say although there's some debate on this, but my first date was in fact at a live theater performance.
Oh.
There's my wife. I don't think was entirely certain that it was in fact a date, but I at least trace that back to our fruitful marriage. Was started through live.
We have things to talk about. I was dating my wife for several weeks before she found out that we were dating. I thought she knew.
Yeah. Well, that's another whole podcast.
That's right. That's right.
That's the follow-up: relationship advice and lessons learned. So I want to jump into this book that you released in March. Because this book is jam full of just insights, nuggets of wisdom, very in some ways very philosophical, big picture, and then in many other ways like very nitty gritty, practical. How do you what do you do with this? So a lot of stuff. Again, especially people that have know the collision, know what I do. Right in my this is catnip for me. This all this meta story stuff is the stuff that I that's sort of been one of my passion areas. And I kind of want to get into unpack a little bit, sort of one of what I think kind of your main premise in this book, which is sort of this kind of synergy between the stories that we tell as humans, the stories we encounter, in movies or plays or whatever else. And then also sort of what you call the eternal story, the story that God's unfolding, the story that God is kind of throughout history. And you kind of, you do story, lowercase, sort of the human story, then story, capitalized, kind of the big story. And you sort of unpack that throughout this book, kind of going in both directions. Of hey, you can actually sort of encounter God through these stories, but you also go the other direction of through sort of the lens, through kind of what God's done, who he is, you can actually tell effective stories, and you can actually find more in these stories than you would have without sort of that structure and framework. Can you maybe just explain kind of a little bit of that, that philosophy or that approach?
Yeah. I mean, the big idea of the book, actually, you guys already started this conversation. So, Daniel and Sam, I appreciate you. Episode 41 of your podcast, where you talk about sinners, you get into the whole idea of resurrection stories and how all of these stories that we love have this common arc that is found in the gospel. And that really is my big idea, is that all of storytelling we're hardwired for it. We're hardwired for how we tell story, for the plot of how we tell story. We're hardwired to look for certain characters and character types, character arcs. We're hardwired even in how we approach dialogue and how we approach subtext, how we approach setups and payoffs, how we approach image systems. All of that is kind of hardwired into us. So we look for it in every story that we hear, and this is universal across cultures. You brought that up with Joseph Campbell's work with myth, is that they're all of these stories are kind of the same. And my take on it is that we're hardwired by God for that, because that is how we find God, is through the structure of our stories, through how we tell stories, through the subtext. So whether you're a believer or not, you are still telling God's story in a way through the basic arcs of it. And so that's everything from structure, going from a simplified kind of version of you start in balance. Your story is unbalanced. Your character goes on a quest to restore balance. You get a midpoint that changes everything. You have another quest to respond to the midpoint. You have a crisis. Coming out of the crisis, you come out of it, which is a big part. That's our resurrection. You have a climax, a final battle, and then you end up in a new place. So the real skinny of it is, all of our stories, we want all of our stories to have that. If you try to tell a story to your child at night and skip a beat, they're going to go, no, you missed the part where, right? And then you get the obvious overlay of that is, we start out in balance. We call that the Garden of Eden. You have an unbalance where everything's thrown out of whack. We call that, that's the eating of the apple and being kicked out of the garden, right? We have a quest where God spends, we call it history. God is, or the Old Testament specifically, God is doing everything he can to try to restore balance with us. And then we get a midpoint that changes everything. That's where God's like, hey, everything I've tried did not work. I'm going to become a man. I'm going to let go of my godhood and become a man. And Christ is born into our world. And then we have a response to that, which is Jesus trying to convince us to see things through God eyes in order to restore the relationship. And of course, we have a crisis that comes up. We call that the cross, right? Where God is killed. He is dead. And then we have our eucatastrophe. We have the resurrection out of death. We have the climax, the final battle of Christ and death. And then we end up, in a new balance. We start in a garden. We're going to end in a city, right? We've gone on a journey. Because we've gone on a journey, we are now different people in a different place. And that is the basic outline of every story, but it's God's story. So all of that points us back to God. And within the book, I go even further talking about, the types of characters we look for. Why do we look for them? Let's look at Moses, the type of, setups and payoffs. What are we looking for in setups and payoffs? And here's biblically how setup and payoffs are used. Subtext, like if you don't understand subtext, you can't understand the stoning of the adulterous woman. Because there's a surface message, but most of what's going on in that story is subtext. So as you said, I look at it in both directions. It's like, because of the gospel, we can see this in Thunderbolts. But because we understand Knives Out, we can see this in the reading of Peter's denial, right? So it's a conversation back and forth.
Yeah, one of the interesting things too, like sort of this on like the universal sort of that story structure. And obviously, like, a lot of, like you mentioned, I'm a big Joseph Campbell guy, but there's been a lot of people over the years have they've noticed the similarities. There's been a lot of, they haven't always like reached the same conclusions for why that is, but like it's undeniable that there is sort of this structure. And it's funny because even, obviously there's a lot of like contrarians that want to, well, actually this story and this story doesn't follow, but even a lot of the examples that don't seem to kind of follow that structure, like, are still really only effective because they're operating within that framework. Like, they're subverting it. And like sort of that subversive quality really is only effective because we're measuring it against this template and it's going against it. And it's like, well, it doesn't follow it, but it's very much linked to that structure.
Yeah, and it might be flawed because they didn't know any better, so they poorly made it. And that's why they missed whatever aspect, or they're doing it on purpose, which, again, we get to some of the master storytellers than Nolan. I like to point out Jesus does this with the parable of the lost sons. He's got his audience and he tells a story that has a beginning. It starts out in a balance. The son's at home. Unbalanced, the son takes the money and runs off. Quest, he's trying to find his good life. Crisis, he's got the pigs. And then, climax, he's got his turnaround and he's heading home and he meets dad. And then new balance is there's a son out in the field and the son is complaining. And then the son talks to a servant and then the father comes out and you're like, what the heck just happened, Jesus? You just lost your story. It was so perfect up until then. But if you understand story structure, you see what he's doing. He's actually telling two different stories, which is exactly what Nolan does with all the Batman movies. He's actually telling two different plots that the climax, new balance of one of the plots becomes the setup for the next half. So Batman begins, he's training and becoming Batman. He becomes Batman and he takes on life in Gotham, right? Same with takes on the Joker, and then it transitions to a story about Two-Face. Jesus is doing exactly, he's putting a Nolan on us. He tells one story, he's got two audiences. One audience is made up of tax collectors and other sinners. He tells a story about somebody just like them, who's made the same decision they did, who's run away from God, who's trying to find life in another way, who finds himself at the bottom. And he's saying, here's the resolution to that story. The father runs after, and there's a party. And the party is our balance for the next story about an older son, because he also has an audience of Pharisees. And the Pharisees are the older son. They're the ones who are sitting in judgment saying, how dare you throw a party for the sinners and the tax collectors? Right? Out in the field, and he gives them an unbalance. He's out in the field normally working. He finds out there's this party going on, which unbalances him. He has a quest pulling the dad out to try to convince the dad you shouldn't be doing this. And then Jesus stops talking. There's no climax that takes us to a new resolution. And Jesus knows that that's bad storytelling. And I do have a rule. anytime you find bad storytelling in the Bible, pay attention, you're missing something. Jesus knows that he is not finishing the story. We've ended the song before the final chord, and he knows, so he's looking at the sinners and the tax collectors, and he's saying, here's your complete story. You can choose to end it this way. And then he looks at the Pharisees and he says, I don't know how the story ends. That's up to you. It's up to you to decide, do you go back into the party and celebrate that the lost have been found, or do you stay out in the field where you are right now and mope? This could be a celebration, or it could be a tragedy. It's not my place as the storyteller to tell you how your story's going to end. Completely subverting the form with the design of knowing, because they know the form, they have to answer the question for themselves. They have to, on their way home, finish their story.
Yeah, and you get into in some of the later chapters in the book about that, of like, yeah, you can break the and we'll get into some of that in a second in this podcast too, but you can kind of break the structure, the form, but like, to be effective, you got to know, you got to know what you're doing, in an intentional way, and kind of work off of that.
My theater mentor Howard Stein would say, you can't break a rule if you don't know the rule exists. And if you want it to be effective, you have to know, oh, this is why the rule exists, which is why breaking it works.
Yeah, and I think even just like intuitively, and maybe I'm just thinking too highly of myself, but like, you can almost tell, like in a story, it's like, this is a very intentional, he's unsettling me, expectations, as opposed to just like, they just didn't think this one through. This needed another script edit passed through.
And I've seen both. I've seen ones where it's like, oh, the author didn't know what they were trying to say. Or, like Rian Johnson, Knives Out, he messes with genre because he knows the rules of genre. He knows we know the rules of genre. And he fools us only because we know the rules, so we're ahead of him when he's not even talking. I mean, he doesn't actually break any rules. He just implies that he's breaking the rules. Yeah.
So kind of to move into just, so if you have this sort of premise that, as you sort of say, God is everywhere. You can see God through everything. I think you have a great line somewhere in one of the early chapters about, what a shame it is, like, for us to miss it, like when there's so much of God. I guess my question is, like, as a Christian, that's loves movies, stories, plays, whatever it might be. Like, in one sense, that's a very exciting thing, and I think that's become a more common. There's been more emphasis on that, of like seeing the gospel in films, and there's been places like The Collision. That's a lot of the sort of stuff we do. I guess my question is, like, is there a temptation to go too far with that? Of like, okay, you have this big structure,
absolutely,
and to sort of try and force it may not be obvious on the surface, I'm going to make this a Christian allegory, and it is going to line up with all this stuff. And there's got to be a Christ figure in every story. And like, how do you sort of have that balance of like, like I think C.S. Lewis would say, receiving rather than using, like we seeing what's actually in the story, the reflections, as opposed to like bringing that on the outside and making these
imposing it.
Yeah.
Which actually, so three things on that. One, that's one of the mistakes that Christian movies make. As we're making it, the Christian market movies, is we just impose something on a story that's not there, and we say, oh, it's now Christian because they recited the verse, kind of a thing. It actually is an absolute temptation. I have an assignment for my screenwriting class here at Asbury where every week a different student will do a devotional based on a movie. And one of the requirements is it cannot be a religious movie. So they have to take a movie and say, here's how I learned more about God through this moment in this movie. But I try to emphasize to them, but it might be a moment in the movie that doesn't make the movie Christian, and it doesn't make the whole edifying even. And I had a student who chose Final Destination as his movie, which is a horror movie. And he actually did a really nice job. If you don't know the movies, the idea of Final Destination is it's a group of people. One of them will have a premonition. So the first one, they're all on an airplane. He has this premonition that the airplane is going to blow up and they're all going to die. And so he gets off of the plane and a bunch of others get off with him. They're standing there arguing with him because he ruined their trip as the plane takes off and blows up and everybody else dies. And then the rest of the movie is death stalking them because they were supposed to be dead and they're not. And so that's the horror of the movie, is death now wants to kill them. And so the theme that was the message that was pulled out to play with, the devotional message, was just this idea that we as humans convince ourselves that we are beyond death, that we're better than death. And we live our lives as if death does not exist, but it does. And this movie is a reminder that you're not going to cheat death. You have to go through death, right, to the next life, which I like. Okay, that's a little nugget that you can pull from that, and I agree with that nugget. And then the student went on and said, that's why all of the Final Destination movies are Christian movies. I'm like, no. You've gone too far, because, yeah, that one nugget is true, but the rest of what's in there, and especially with the sequels, which, a lot of them become just, there's celebrations of the horror of death. There's celebrations of what are cool ways we can find for people to die. That's what they're celebrating. They're not celebrating this theological concept that we are mortal beings and need to wrestle with our mortality. Yeah, so that's kind of the danger of going, just because I saw this nugget in there, or just because there's a piece of truth in there, doesn't mean that it's all true. And the reverse, right? There are people who will say, well, you can't find truth in this movie because it was made by a non-Christian and it has falsehoods in it. Like, you need to have that discerning lens. So I think about the bronze snake. So Moses, right, in the desert, the Israelites are griping. God is like, I'm sick of this, sends these poisonous snakes. They bite the people are dying. Moses goes and says, Lord, can you possibly forgive them? And he says, sure, make a snake out of bronze, put it on a pole, lift it up. Anybody who looks up will be saved. And so he does that. Everybody who looks up will be saved, right? The next time the bronze snake appears in the Bible, it's later on, it's being worshipped as an idol because it had this power. Right? And it's like, no. You looked at the thing that was a symbol and you said it wasn't a symbol, but it was the thing. And so they end up having to break and destroy the bronze snake because we've overstepped. We didn't understand. No, that's a metaphor. That's not the thing. And then the next time that the bronze snake appears is in John 3, when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus and trying to get Nicodemus to understand what the heck is going on here. He says, it's just like the bronze snake. The Son of Man will be lifted up on a pole. Everyone who looks up to him will be saved. So we're seeing this piece of art go through the transition of being a great symbol with powerful meaning to becoming abused by people seeing more in it than is there, to then being redeemed again by saying, no. It was there as a symbol. It's meant for a symbol. It was meant for me to be able to explain to you what the Son of Man is going to do. So that's how we need to watch movies.
Yeah, and I love that. That's one of my favorites. The bronze snake. Like I just get a kick out of the fact that like these Israelites are being bitten by snakes, and then their salvation is like make a staff and like make it look like a snake. Like make them look at snake. It's like the last thing in the world they want to see. Which I mean, I've always, obviously you can read too much into it, but just the power of like art to sort of like I think a lot of, and you sort of get into it in your book a bit, but kind of some of the Christian art, Christian movies, like very comforting, very not necessarily honest, and like at least in one sense, the bronze snake is like, hey, this isn't going to make you feel good. Like it's the last thing you want to see, but it's going to shake you and like get you back on track with me. Sam, I don't know if you have any questions before we move into some of as far as like telling stories or.
No, let's get on into the storytelling.
Yeah, so I wondered because some of my favorite people, again, like I fell into sort of doing this collision thing, but like my heart growing up is I wanted to be a teacher. Like I think there's no higher calling than investing in young people, training them up, especially in something like the arts. Some of our guests that we've had on this podcast have been other teachers. So you have the perfect. You've worked in like in doing the creating, doing the writing in that world, but now you also have the opportunity to to train up Christians to do that. What do you sort of see as the role going forward in our culture and the kingdom of God, whatever you want to have, whatever have you, like just of Christian storytellers?
So storytelling is critical. I mean, it's this, but it's was recently recently at an event at a Christian I don't even know what you'd call it. It was a Christian type event, and one of the things that they said was, they want to make it clear to us that the Bible is not a bunch of stories; it's a history. And it made me sad to hear them say that. I mean, I've heard it a lot, and we've all heard it a lot. And what they were trying to say, I understand what they were trying to say, which is this happened, it's real. But when you say it's not story, you're limiting you're limiting it to just a history, right? An example of history is George Washington on a certain date got in a boat with a bunch of people and he rowed across the Delaware River. It was the Delaware, right? So what do we learn from that? Well, we learned that on this date, there was a guy named George Washington, and George Washington and this number of people got into a boat and they crossed this river. That's what we've learned. It means what it means, right? Story means more than what it means. This is why Jesus taught in story. Because when he told a parable, when the lawyer says, well, who's my neighbor? He says, well, your neighbor's the people around you. Done. And she's like, no, that's not enough of an answer. That's not big enough of an answer. That's too small of an answer. Let me tell you a story. There's this guy who's on his way. He's on the road to Jericho, and he got beat up by robbers, right? And he tells a story. And after the story is over, he doesn't summarize it like we do with sermons, right? We tell the story, and then we tell you what it means. Jesus tells the story, and then rarely tells you what it means unless the disciples are whining about it. You got to tell me what it means, right? Why? Well, because the moment he tells what it means, the only thing we're focused on is the explanation, not the story, which has now limited it. It's made it smaller. So it only functions as this exact meaning. It doesn't get inside of you. You don't have to wrestle with it. You don't have to make it your own, right? So the idea, which true history, and I want to say this to the historians out there, because some of the historians are going, wait, history does mean more than it means. It's like, yes, if you're approaching it as story, which the best historians approach it as story, because God is the designer of history. So George Washington crossing the Delaware tells us things about courage and faith and taking risks. And, there's a lot of things you can draw from it, but only if you see it as story. If you see it as just fact, then it is just that. If we don't have storytellers in the church, a couple things happen. Number one, the church gets weaker and weaker, which I think we have seen since the Reformation, since the Enlightenment. I'm sorry, not the Reformation, but the Enlightenment, where we've decided, the world said, we can prove everything through explanation. That's how we're going to solve all the world's problems, is through explanation. And the church, the church had two responses. One was, the world is a mystery, and we're going to revel in the mystery. The Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, and then the Protestants were like, no. We're going to explain everything. You're right. There is no mystery. There is nothing we can't explain. We're going to explain everything, right? And we've gotten kind of poorer because of that. I think we're on our way back with, with everything within the arts, the music. You see, Mako Fujimura talking about culture care by using art itself. A lot of the unexplainable. We can explain God. We can put him in a box, sure. But once he's in a box, he's smaller. When he's not in the box, he's God size. And when we put him in a box, we make him human, intelligible. So we need the storytellers in the church to make the church richer. And we also need to, which, is the history of Hollywood. It's the history of pick a medium. Hollywood, the church was really involved in Hollywood when movies first started. And then they were like, no, that's the devil's playground. We'll give it to him. So if story is the only way you can capture the fullness of life, the fullness of God, the fullness of purpose, the fullness of character, story is the only way you can do it. And as a church, we're saying, hey, are you an atheist? You get all the stories. We're not going to tell any of them. We're not going to, right? We're giving that over to you. The entire world gets poorer because of it. So having storytellers who know the storyteller, having storytellers who are open to allowing true stories to come through them, And by that, I don't mean stories that we've decided are true, but stories that we're willing to get out of the way of because God has decided they're true. That's when we change the world. And we can point to a bunch of secular movies that have changed the world. Fewer Christian movies that can change the world because we're just now saying, oh, that's right. That's right. We're supposed to be storytellers.
Yeah, well, I think that's one of the things me and Sam we've gotten to a bunch over the time we've been doing this podcast is there's sort of this like paradox of it's like as the church there's at least traditionally there's been an awareness that like I mean it's all narratives, it's all whoever's telling the best stories is the one that's shaping the culture, and there's like a sense that we sort of agree that like Hollywood is telling, Hollywood as a unit, if you want to use that, like is telling stories that are shaping culture, and a lot of those stories aren't edifying stories, and therefore they're shaping culture. And so like as the church to respond, it's almost like we acknowledge like yes, there's power in that, but for the solution, it's not to tell stories, it's to just get Hollywood to stop telling stories. If we can just sort of get them to stop doing that, but there just hasn't been sort of that connect the dots of like until recently, like
Yeah.
okay, well, why don't we tell stories? Why don't we
Yeah.
tell compelling stories that touch on these universal, sort of eternal story elements?
Yeah, and thankfully we've had those storytellers, but they're not always identified as Christian because they don't fit. A common problem that we have in having conversations like the one we're having right now is what is a Christian movie? And Christian movie as a genre is defined by the audience, not the content. It's movies made for, and when we say Christian movie, typically we mean movies made for a Protestant Christian audience, more typically a white Protestant Christian audience. And that, so then we start talking about Christian movies, it throws us because really what Daniel, Sam, and I are trying to do, if I can speak for you and you can yell at me if not, is we're trying to tell Christ-filled stories. And maybe they're religious in content, maybe they're not. Maybe the church wants to watch them. Maybe people outside of the church actually want to watch them. So how do we find that? And that also affects, so the Christian market stories have the similar problem that, of what you just said of, oh yeah, we realize we can tell stories, so now we're telling stories, but are we telling them as marketing? So, listen to this story so you'll join the church. So I'm gonna shape the story in a way that has no negatives into it. Does the lives of the Christians, the only reason they're hard is because there are atheists around them. If you got rid of the atheists, they'd never have a problem. They'd never, you become a Christian, you'll become wealthy. Become a Christian, you'll become famous. Become a Christian, you'll become, you'll have power, right? Which is not true. So are we going to shape it that way, or are we going to tell the stories that the secular world is telling because the secular world is trying to deal with the problems that they're actually having? And can we tell stories that address those problems?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different paths we could go down from there. One, when you were talking about history and history as story, I was just looking over here on my bookshelf, and I don't know if you've ever read any of Eric Larson's books, like in the Garden of Beasts or Dead Wake. So just a small plug for Eric Larson. He does incredible histories, but in a narrative format.
Yeah.
And that's so much more enjoyable to read. You're like, okay, you're following the American diplomat's family in Berlin in the late 20s and early 30s. And what was that story like? So that's one thing. And then you mentioned how the church was really involved in Hollywood in the beginning. Why do you, and you may know the answer, you may not, but why do you think the church decided that Hollywood was, Satan's offspring and could no longer be engaged with? Yeah, maybe that's too strong of a word, but
no, it's not too strong
why
at
was
all.
that? Why
That's
was
a
that
literal.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it has been the literal accusation is that Satan runs it. I've been accused of, why would you do work for Satan? It's like, what work for Satan did I do? You made a movie. You made a moving image. historically, we know the events that kind of went to the church kind of moving further away. Part of it was the scandals in the 20s and 30s, and then we came back with, well, the way we're gonna influence movies is by the code. We're going to tell you what content to put in and what content not to allow in, and that kind of, when the 60s happened and people were like, you know what, we're just going to produce something that doesn't have the code. The big problem, I think, which is a pride problem and a community problem, is like the Pharisees, we don't get along with people who are not us. So we're happy to make movies as long as people who don't disagree with us aren't also making movies. So you see this, again, straight from the Pharisees of Jesus. How dare you be hanging out with those people? They didn't say, how dare you behave the way they are? How dare you make, sin the way that they're sinning? How dare you make movies just like their movies? It's how dare you be in the same company with them? So as we're progressing through Hollywood, through the history of filmmaking, we're making biblical movies, we're making Christian movies, we're making movies with good positive themes. Hollywood is making movies based on religion. Hollywood's a weird term because technically I'm Hollywood, just so you know. Anytime anybody gripes about Hollywood, I'm like, you're talking about me too. But even the secular filmmakers who were not affiliated with church or affiliated with religion were also making, and still do to this day, make movies about good values and good morals. But they're also making the other movies. They're making the movies that say the things that they want to say. They're making the movies that include people as heroes that we don't want to see as heroes. And so rather than being comfortable in the discomfort of the tension of, I'm making movies, sometimes I make them with Joe, sometimes Joe makes his own movies. When he makes his own movies, I disagree with the content. Instead of saying we're going to live in tension, I either say, as Daniel said, Joe, you're not allowed to make movies anymore. Or I say, well, then I'm not going to make movies. And so we move away from the people who are doing the craft. It's hard to live in that tension. And I agree with that. It's hard to live in the tension. But backing off is just illogical. There's Disney, I don't know if you've heard of the Disney company.
I have.
Often gets itself, the family-friendly company, right? There's a lot of people who believe that Christian and family-friendly are identical. So they get really upset when this Christian company, Disney, makes movies that don't feel Christian to them, right? Which is kind of silly in and of itself. But a while back, they spun off the company that's named after the drive that the Disney studio is on. I'm blanking on it right now. To produce kind of the more adult stuff.
Pixar?
So they had, pardon?
Is it Pixar? Is that what we're...
No. It's the company that makes their R-rated movies.
Oh.
So it's a different distribution company. It begins with an A. I can't remember it. But anyway, so when they were first kind of got into we want to make adult films as well, they made an R-rated movie that did not depict the church well. So Christians, and this was back in the 90s, I think is when this happened, maybe the 80s. All of these decades blur to me. So the Christian response was boycott. We're going to boycott them. And that'll teach them. And now that we've boycotted them, they'll get, and from the 80s, Disney got its act together, right? It's never made a controversial film since. Because what happens, the logic of it is the problem. So what happens is you've got all these Christians who only are going to see the PG, the G and the PG, and the PG-13, if that even existed then, movies. And they're supporting Disney. Disney makes an R-rated movie. The Christians aren't going to the R-rated movie, right? We can see that. So this is the year that they make that, and it's probably more like this. For those of you who are only listening, I have my hands up showing this many PG movies, this many R movies. We boycott. So over the next year, we don't attend any of their PG or their G or their PG-13 movies. So the amount of money they're making on their G, PG, PG-13 movies goes down. We weren't attending their R movies anyway. So there are movies make just as much money. It's not going down. So as a business, they go, oh, there's more money in R-rated movies than there is in PG-13 and G-rated movies. We need to make more R-rated movies. And that's what happens, right? We're boycotting the wrong, we're sending the wrong message by how we're choosing to respond. So if we say, oh, we're out of there, there's no one in there to control. There's no reason for them to stop making their R-rated movies, using that specific example. But if we stay in there, if we say, you know what we're going to do, Disney, is we're going to double down and we're going to see more G-rated movies than we ever have before. It's like, oh, they're making money. We see this all the time. Passion of the Christ came out. Suddenly the studios wanted to make religious films, right? The Chosen comes out. Suddenly Amazon wants to have a religious division, right? They see, the vote is not what are we going to ignore. The vote is what are we going to support?
Yeah, and there's just always, again, at least as of recording this episode, is the day that Amazon just announced like the Wonder Project, which made the House of David show, is like they're launching their own, like they're still sort of within Amazon, but it's going to become its own like paid subscription service where you pay, and that's where the next season of the House of David and it you sort of see in real time some of that tension of like, okay, we're kind of making movies, and like we sort of broke out of that like subculture. We're on Amazon, and yet there's this sort of that push to, but like, how do we help Christians avoid all the stuff that's not, well, we pay for this. You log into Amazon, but then you log into this other app, and then you see the stuff that's, the family-friendly kind of content.
We're safe. It makes us safe.
Yeah.
It also allows the atheists to be safe. They don't have to risk accidentally watching The Chosen and wondering who this Christ guy is.
Well, do you think that it's the audience that's driving that? Because I haven't read anything about the Wonder Project and this recent development, but is that, you think, because of the audience for the House of David, they're wanting a separate app or whatever? Or is that more just like a business decision from Amazon?
It's going to be a business decision, but it's going to be based on their research. We've seen this over and over again I think Amazon would be happy to have all of the House of David fans watching the regular Amazon Prime shows. I didn't know this was happening, so I'm learning. I'm just learning. Thank you, Daniel. But they don't have to deal with the complaints if not. I mean, just about every time the networks have tried to put Christian characters on TV, one of the complaints often is, how come there's no Christian characters in these shows? You've got LGBTQ characters, but you've got people in wheelchairs. You got black people. Everybody's represented but Christians. Why aren't Christians represented? Well, that's because when you put a black character on a TV show, the black community doesn't write hate mail to the network. And just about every time they've tried to put a Christian character on a TV show, the Christian character is flawed, because every television show character is flawed. And everybody's complaining. It's like, well, how come on the show where everybody is sinning, the Christian character said a bad word? Well, because he's sinning, just like everybody else. There's a fantastic show, I think it was NBC tried to do, called Nothing Sacred, years ago, that took place in a Catholic church, inner city Catholic church. And it had three priests, a liberal priest, a conservative priest, and a moderate priest. And it had a nun who was conservative to moderate. And it dealt with a lot of issues, and it was messy, just like church is, the way that church runs. And it was boycotted, and there were protests by Christians before it aired. Not a single Christian had seen an episode, and they were boycotting it because it's NBC, so therefore it's going to be bad. It's not going to represent us well, so Christians do not support it. So NBC does not want to put Christian characters on if the church is going to attack them for it. So if they're going to have House of David and the Christians love it, but the Christians are like, you know what? I went to watch House of David, and then I saw this R-rated sex series, and I watched it with my kids, and how dare you have that on there? It's like, well, you didn't use any discernment of your own, but you're going to blame Amazon. You're not going to blame your bad parenting, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because this seems to be the only arena in which Christians do this, or at least maybe do it the loudest. It's like you don't do this with other areas where you spend your money typically. I mean, they
it's the
boycott Target, I think,
right.
often, but like,
Disney has a day where they allow people in that we don't like. We'll boycott. I don't know. I think, yeah, Sam, I'm going to challenge you on that because we do that with music as well. Amy Grant she's just a child of God. We just love her. Wait, she sang a song that doesn't have Jesus in it? We're going to boycott Amy Grant. Sandy Patty has a divorce. We're going to boycott, our Christian music. I think we want it too clean. I think we're too judgmental. We're not discerning because you have to be.
I think that's what I mean. Like, I think
Yeah.
not. I think it's in the arts in general.
Yeah, in the
And
arts. Yeah, you're
Daniel
right.
and I have talked about this
You're right.
some before, but there's a special thing that happens, I think, in the art world, whether it's a theater,
Yeah.
movie, music, whatever. It's somehow different from the other areas of our life
Yeah.
that we have to live. And so
Yeah, you're right.
there's
You're
a
right.
special aversion, I think,
Hmm.
to disagreeable content. It's like, well, but like you shop at Walmart, you know,
Right. Right.
I bet Walmart sells things that you wouldn't buy.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
so why is it that I think as a church, and I think it is a sad indictment to the church that, it is so sort of aggressive towards entertainment companies for this, and
Yeah.
I think it comes from a good place. And I think
Hmm.
a lot of the people who have these feelings towards Hollywood or whatever entertainment distribution company you can think of, I think it can come from a good place, but it seems like it's always kind of missing the point.
Yeah. It comes down to are movies, theater, television, music, are we meant to engage with them? Or are they just supposed to be safety things that we don't have to think about, that doesn't challenge us in any way, or that we don't have to discern? When we teach, our young children, we don't want them to watch something they're going to misunderstand and not follow. When they get older, we should want to teach them how to discern. How can you listen to somebody on the playground say something you disagree with and know whether you disagree with it or not automatically accept it, or not automatically shout it down? Like, how do you deal with being in the tension when you're alongside? And I think a lot of Christians want their entertainment to be safe versus engaging. Just like Aslan, they want Aslan to be safe versus good. And I think we get that when, I worked, I did adjunct for a little bit there's a Christian school on the West Coast. The theater department did a play that challenged kind of some of the norms. They did a Shakespeare play, but the way they cast it was a little challenging to some of the norms. And after every performance, they had a talk back where they said, all right, what did you see? What does the Bible have to say about what you saw? Did it challenge your preconceived notions? Is it actually conflicting with the Bible? Should it have been done? Should we be approaching this issue in a different way? And the theology department at the school heard about this and demanded that the theater department be shut down. Not just we shouldn't do this production.
Just the whole department.
They killed the entire department.
Wow.
And when the director said, "But we're asking great questions," their response was, "Theater or art is not supposed to ask questions; it's supposed to answer questions," which should make you cringe if you're an artist. Should make you a cringe if you read about any of the art in the Bible. But I think a lot of the church has bought into that of we're not supposed to watch a movie and grow, unless you think growth is just intellectually answering questions. We're not supposed to watch a movie and ask more about God. Even shows. I'll tell you one more theater story. And Sam, you'll be able to edit this whole episode down because we're going long, I know.
Oh, no, nonsense. Let it rip.
Yeah, so this is a Taproot theater story. My friend Karen Lund, who's now the producing artistic director. At the time, she's the associate artistic director. And she fielded a phone call from an irate subscriber. Taproot Theater, Christian staffed, but they do a regular season. They'll do Neil Simon, they'll do whatever. Used to also tours to churches, tours to schools. It's got a lot going on. And so the subscriber called and said, I'm canceling my subscription because of this season. And she said, well, what do you mean? It's like, well, you've lost your Christian roots. You're not doing any Christian story, any Christian plays. And I said, well, wait a minute. We did this play. And they said, yes, but that was about Catholics. That doesn't count. It's like, well, we did this play with these themes. And they were like, yeah, but it wasn't direct. And then Karen's like, wait, we did Godspell. Godspell is directly based on the Gospel of Matthew. And the patron said, yes, but you made it so enjoyable, even non-Christians liked it. And wow. That's when Karen said, you know what, you're right. You need to cancel your subscription. You don't belong here because you don't get what we're doing. You don't get it. But that is, I hear echoes of that a lot in, you made that, non-Christians liked that. And they weren't, necessarily converted at the end. They didn't become Christians necessarily, but they enjoyed it. They engaged with it. I've gotten a little bit of that in my movie "And Lawfully Yours." People are like, yeah, but atheists say they enjoy the journey of this woman going through church, right? Are we looking for our entertainment? What are we looking for in our entertainment, Sam? And I think that's really what it comes down to with the arts, right? Do we want it just to be safe? Do we want to not have to engage with it? And are we looking for something that we know is safe because it's only for us? It's not for anybody outside of us. Yeah. I think it's kind of challenging. There's value.
Value. I know we talked about that in an episode with some Candace Cameron Bure comments about just the reduction of sort of the arts to almost like some sort of spiritual therapeutic escapism of just sort of it's there to pat you on the back every morning on your commute when you listen to it or plug it in, but it's not there to challenge you or shake you up or make you engage with it. We just sort of take it in as sort of an affirmation. But I think all this comes down to just Christians need to tell good stories, like stories. Yes. I mean, even beyond just the stories you see in the sacred space of a theater. This narratives in general are what's shaping culture, and I think Christians have. I hope you would agree with that, Sean. I think Christians have taken that to heart, and I think people like you teaching young storytellers will hopefully pay dividends, and there'll be a harvest of just more people thoughtfully engaging. For those of you that aren't able to be in, which I'm sure would be a very engaging classroom for Sean Gaffney's class, I do recommend Metastory. We'll drop the link in the description so you can purchase that on Amazon, because there's tons of tools in there to help from any level of story engagement, whether you're a writer or you're watching stories. Just a lot of wisdom in there. But speaking of wisdom and things that I have no doubt will be engaging, that leads us to the final segment of this podcast, which is things we like that you should like too. So Sean, this is we will give you the floor. We will give our listeners a week off of having to listen to our recommendations that don't seem to haven't gained a whole lot of traction yet. I've been trying to get people to listen to more metal music, and it just doesn't seem like I'm doing a good enough job. Or Sam's farming TV shows and British shows, but so we will let you.
Or Norwegian disaster movies.
Yeah, I stand by that.
Yeah, thankfully for you, no pressure, because we've set the bar exceedingly low.
Low.
But take it away.
Sure. So the thing I have that I discovered recently that I thought was new, but it's not. It's about 5 years old. Is the podcast Dolly Parton's America.
I've heard of this.
Yeah, it's Jad Abumrad and Shima Oliei.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jad Abumrad. Yeah.
Thank you. I looked at the last names and I'm like, they don't say their own last names on the show, so I'm not going to get their last names right. But it's a lovely look at it surprised me. I listened to the first episode just because people kept recommending it, but I knew that I wasn't going to be interested. And it is fascinating. It starts with it's Jad, right? Is how he says his name?
I think so. Yeah.
The inspiration in a way was he was attending a Dolly Parton concert and saw somebody with a MAGA hat standing next to a lesbian couple, and they were getting along and partying together. And he's like, what force on earth could possibly bring everybody together under one roof and not have the divisiveness that exists? So he's looking at Dolly Parton's career, her growing up, but also what is her effect on America? What is her relationship? There's an episode devoted to faith, and that's kind of part of, I love again, engaging and challenging ourselves is neither Jad nor Shima, as far as Shima has said, are at all religious. And Jad, in fact, says, I was nervous because I wanted to talk to Dolly Parton about religion specifically, but I knew that was going to finally be the thing that makes me go, oh yeah, I don't like her after all, or split them or somehow divide. And her answers actually drew him even more into the world. So very, very interesting kind of look at the divide of what power one singer might have, about how living a life driven by love first comes around. I highly recommend it. I just, every episode had something in there that made me think more deeply. Yep.
That's awesome. And Jad Abumrad, I think he does Radio Lab, which is an NPR, I believe, podcast, WNYC. So that's how I know, because I feel like I do recall hearing about that. I never listened to it, but I think maybe I'm always looking for a good podcast recommendation.
Yeah.
So.
And he has a lot of access to Dolly herself. So it's not a complete outsiders, but he also interviews the family, her security guards, her fans, different fans who've rewritten her work, stars who've worked with her. It's fantastic.
And like she's such a national treasure too.
She is.
I feel like the Venn diagram of like everyone in America, like probably the only space that intersects all circles is that Dolly Parton is awesome. Like,
yeah.
I think that's the one thing we can all agree on.
We can all agree.
That she is awesome. But speaking of awesome people, Sean, it has been a total pleasure to have you on. We could have stretched this podcast on for hours, which just means we'll have to bring you back on.
I'm happy to come on. We haven't even gotten to, we got sidetracked so quickly.
No, yeah, that's what we do. We like to get sidetracked, and there's so much to get into. Obviously, like I said, highly recommend everyone check out this book, Meta Story: What Marvel and the Messiah Can Teach Us About Great Storytelling. We'll drop the links to that in all the descriptions. For any other way that like people can connect with you, or like I don't know if you have a blog or
website. I have a website, www.gaffneyinkwell. That's GAF as in Frank, F as in Frank, NEYINKWELL.com. You can find the book on there. You can find I have a newsletter for anybody who's a writer. It just sends tips out once a month. It has I do have a YouTube series where I exercise while watching movies, and if I see something I either as a positive or a negative example, I just pause it, jump off the bike, and record myself talking about it. So you can see little 5-minute clips of me commenting on movies and TV shows. And you can also get the book anywhere that books are. It's on Amazon and everywhere else. But if you order it through my website, and
there you go. We'll leave a link to that in the show notes as well. Then.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, I encourage you, because when I was stalking you before you came on that podcast, I saw some of those little clips of just observations out and about on walks in different places. So encourage everyone, follow Sean on social media, check out his website, and check out his book. Thanks so much once again, and we hope you will all join us again next week, every week, for more conversations on faith and pop culture.